Hey guys, welcome back. We are in chapter 14, section 3 today. Last time we talked about the growth of the villages and the towns across Europe. What we're having here is kind of the end of the feudal system, and we start leaning us more towards a centralized government and eventually the development of nations. The earliest nations that we're going to have in Europe that have a strong unified government are going to be England and France. Today we're going to take a look pretty much at the development of England and France. What we're going to find out is they're going to take a very similar path that England takes. So we're going to look more at England today. For centuries, the English have these different waves of invasions coming in. They originally were a province of Rome, and in the 800s, we have the Vikings invade, not the Minnesota ones, but the real ones from Northern Europe. They're going to come in and invade, and so we have all these different cultures that as we have each invasion that comes through, more and more the culture is going to change and kind of become like a mini mixing pot. We have a melting pot in America, the same kind of things happening in England. And so we have the Angles, we have the Saxons, and they kind of come together and meld into one. And so Alfred the Great comes out of that, and he delivers us from the fury of the Northern, is what is referred to, and turns back the Vikings from 871 to 899. He gets rid of the Vikings, but some of their ways are going to stick around. And so around 1016, about 100 years later, we have a Danish king, and he invades, and he takes kind of the ways of the Vikings and the ways of the Anglo-Saxons, and he kind of mixes them into one, and this is kind of the birth of England here. About 30 years after that, 1042, we have King Edward. He takes control and he dies. The problem is he dies before he leaves an heir to the throne. Remember, we talked about dynasties and things like that. Usually the oldest son is going to take over. Well, he didn't name an heir, and so everything's kind of in chaos here in England, which kind of brings us to the Norman conquest. The Norman conquest comes from not a man named Norman, but Normandy. The Normandy, we'll talk much later in the course about the beaches of Normandy and D-Day during World War II. But in France, there's a northern region called Normandy, and there is a man there, William the Conqueror is his name, and he was a cousin of King Edward. He decides, hey, I wouldn't mind being the king. And so he comes across with his army, of course, to England, and he says, hey, this was my cousin, I'm the king now. And he comes over, and there's another man named Harold Godwinson, and he says, no, you aren't even English here, you need to go away. I am the one who's going to be the king. And so they have a battle, and the two armies fight. This is the Battle of Hastings, and what happens is William is going to win, and Harold winds up getting a sword through his eye. So it pays to be the winner, I suppose, and not the loser in this battle. So William takes over the land, and anybody who supported Harold, he takes their land away as well. And he eventually declares all of England to be his. He owns everything. He's like Century 21. He's going to be kind of the realtor and decide who gets what land. He gives any land to that he wants to the Norman invaders who pledged their allegiance to him, so that his fighters, his people who came in. The two kings who come after him, or the several kings that came after him, I guess it wasn't just two, they had two goals really over the next few centuries. The first one is to hold their lands that they had in France. So that was what they originally had. Remember Normandy and that area there. And they wanted to add to that area. And then they wanted to limit the power of the nobles, so kind of the rich people, the higher ups. They wanted to limit that and make sure that they were in charge and not going to be overthrown. And they wanted to limit the power of the church. Remember how we talked about how strong the church was in this era. So they want to limit the power of the nobles and the church. So Henry II comes along, and he adds to the lands by marrying French royalty, which is a very good way to do that. So Henry II strengthened the royal courts as well by sending judges to all parts of England at least once a year. And what these judges would do, they wouldn't just settle lawsuits and things. They would do that, but they would also collect taxes. They would put out sentences and things like that. What would happen is you'd have juries of about they would be 12 members, and they would as soon as there would be a crime, they would come together, they would hear the case, and then you would wait for the judge to come about. Now remember, the judge might be there just once a year, and so the problem is you might be sitting in jail for a crime for an entire year. The jury says, yeah, we don't think he did it, and then the judge says, okay, he's free to go. Well, you didn't do it, and you're sitting in jail for a long time. And so if we skip forward about 500 years, we think to our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, where a speedy trial. This is what they're kind of protecting against, things like this. The judge would come around once a year, and he would say, here, okay, he'd talk to the jurors themselves and say, what did you think? Did he do it? Did he not do it? How much of a sentence should I give him? And things like that. And these judges' rulings would then become known as common law. And so common law then, each judge after them would try to follow the precedent set by the judge before him. And so this becomes known as whatever they decide kind of becomes the law. And so we still have some of our laws come from English common law way back in the 1200s. Then what happens is Henry dies, and Richard the Lionhearted, who is a hero from the Crusades that we talked about last section, he takes power. And everybody's very happy because he was this hero and all of this. But he dies, and his younger brother then takes the throne. Well, the problem with John, who is his younger brother, is he's an awful, awful leader. He loses all of their land in France. Just a terrible, terrible leader as far as a military leader. And when that happens, he then starts taxing people, tried to squeeze any money out of anybody that he can. He alienates the church completely, goes completely against the church. He starts taking away town charters from people. He raised taxes to an all-time high. People absolutely hated him. And so on June 15th of 1215, John is forced to sign what's known as the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is a document which is really going to change the history of not just England but of the world. In fact, there's a copy of the Magna Carta here in America in the National Archives, where you can see it right before you go in to see the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and things like that. That's how important this document is. We have it on display here in America. But what would happen is the nobles are concerned about what's going to happen, that he is, remember, taxing everybody to death, that he's making other nations or other areas of the world mad at them, and for their own safety, they decided they're going to make him sign this document, which is going to try and kind of back us up into feudal times again. So the rights that come out of this were not meant for all English citizens. They were meant for the nobles, but they would wind up being given to all the English citizens. And so the Magna Carta becomes a much bigger thing than it really was, even just for the nobles. And so the first thing it does is it says no taxation without representation. This should sound familiar if you ever taken American history. No taxation without representation. In other words, the king can't tax somebody unless there's a representative that says, yeah, okay, this is probably a necessary tax. There you have the right to jury trials, and so the judge doesn't just get to decide based on the jury. The jury is going to decide these things with the judge. And then you have the protection of the laws, and so the laws just can't change from king to king to king to king. These laws are set in stone a little bit better, and so these become some of the basic rights in the United States and in England today. All come from this document. And so Edward I comes along, and he needs to raise taxes, and he says, well, we have to have taxation with representation. So he figures out how to do this, and what he does is he calls 2 burgesses from every borough. A burgess is going to be basically a representative from every borough, and 2 knights from every county. So a borough is basically a city, a county you're more familiar with, and he decides he's going to have them serve as the Parliament in 1295. So this becomes known as the model parliament because future kings would say, okay, well, how Edward did this is a pretty good idea, and so we're going to go ahead and do it the same way. So this is the model parliament. So the burgesses and knights become known as the House of Commons because these are just regular people, and a group of noblemen and some bishops get together and they're like, we don't like that these just common people have the power, and they decide maybe we should form something as well, and so they become known as the House of Lords. And even to this day today, the English Parliament is set up into two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Well, the big part of this that's important to know is this is our first instance in the world, really, of a checks and balance system. We talk about the checks and balances here in America. This is in England at the time. We have the House of Commons and the House of Lords have a check on the king, and the king can then kind of overrule them back and forth, and so we have this checks and balance system in place. That's kind of it for today. We'll talk a little bit more about this and do a little bit more about this in class, but have a great night, and we will see you tomorrow. Thanks.